Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the frozen shores of Scandinavia, where winter was not simply a season. It was an enemy that arrived every year without mercy. Long before central heating, supermarkets, weather forecasts, or modern medicine, Viking families faced months of darkness, bitter cold, and uncertainty. Tonight, we will spend time among those communities and discover why Viking winters could become some of the deadliest experiences a person could endure. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the story carry you northward into a world of snow, ice, and survival. The first snow arrived quietly. At least, that is how it often seemed. A few drifting flakes would appear above the fjords. The mountains would begin collecting white caps. Frost would cling to grass during the early hours of morning. The sea remained navigable, and daily life continued much as before. For many Viking farmers, these early signs were not alarming. They were expected. Winter came every year. The true concern was never whether winter would arrive. The concern was how severe it would become. Our story begins in western Norway during the late 10th century. Not with a famous king or legendary warrior, but with an ordinary farmer named Eirik. Eirik owned a modest farm positioned between steep mountains and a narrow inlet of the sea. The land had belonged to his family for generations. It was not particularly rich, but it provided enough grain, livestock, and fish to sustain those who lived there. Throughout summer, every member of the household worked tirelessly. There were sheep to manage. Cattle required attention. Hay had to be harvested and stored. Wood needed cutting. Fishing boats ventured out whenever weather allowed. Every activity served a purpose. Every task prepared the household for the coming darkness. Unlike modern societies, Viking communities could not simply obtain extra supplies if they underestimated winter's demands. There were no trucks bringing food from distant regions. There were no heated warehouses, no emergency deliveries. If a family failed to prepare adequately during summer and autumn, starvation might await them before spring. As autumn deepened, Eirik watched the mountains carefully. The higher slopes had already disappeared beneath fresh snow. Cold winds descended more frequently. Bird migrations signaled changing conditions. Even the animals seemed aware. The sheep clustered together more often. The cattle consumed increasing amounts of fodder. The household's dogs spent longer periods near the hearth. Inside the longhouse, preparations intensified. The Viking longhouse served many purposes. It was home. It was shelter. It was workshop. It was storage facility. Most importantly, during winter, it became a fortress against nature itself. The structure stretched across the landscape like a giant wooden shelter. Thick timber walls provided protection against freezing winds. Turf layers added insulation. A central hearth burned continuously whenever fuel remained available. Yet even the strongest longhouse could never completely defeat the cold. Smoke drifted upward through roof openings. Drafts found countless pathways inside. Temperatures often remained uncomfortable. Residents frequently slept beneath layers of wool and animal skins. During especially harsh nights, frost sometimes appeared inside the building itself. Modern people often imagine Viking life as dominated by raids and battles. Those events certainly occurred, but for most individuals, survival against winter represented a far greater challenge than warfare. A battle might happen once. Winter returned every year, and winter never negotiated. As daylight hours shortened, Eirik's family carefully calculated their resources. Bundles of dried fish hung from rafters. Barrels contained preserved foods. Grain supplies were inspected repeatedly. Every item mattered. An error in calculation could become catastrophic months later. One evening, after completing his work outdoors, Eirik sat near the fire with his wife Astrid. Their children slept nearby. The flames crackled softly. Outside, the wind rattled the wooden walls. Astrid asked the question that occupied everyone's thoughts. Would the stores last until spring? Eirik did not answer immediately. Instead, he stared into the fire. No one could know for certain. The family had prepared diligently. The harvest had been acceptable. Fishing had produced reasonable results. Yet winter possessed many ways to ruin even the best preparations. A prolonged storm could isolate communities. Livestock disease might reduce food supplies. Unexpected cold could increase fuel consumption. Illness could spread through households. Everything depended upon factors beyond human control. That uncertainty weighed heavily upon Viking families. Modern weather forecasts allow people to anticipate conditions days in advance. Vikings possessed no such advantage. They relied upon observation, experience, tradition, and luck. Sometimes luck mattered most. The first major snowstorm arrived in early winter. Dark clouds gathered above the mountains. The wind strengthened throughout the afternoon. By evening, visibility had nearly vanished. Snow blew horizontally across the landscape. The world beyond, the longhouse, disappeared behind a curtain of white. Inside, family members remained close to the fire. The storm continued through the night. Then another day, then another. When calm weather finally returned, the surrounding landscape had transformed. Snowdrifts reached astonishing heights. Paths vanished. Fences disappeared. Travel became difficult and dangerous. For isolated farms throughout Scandinavia, this represented a common experience. Winter did not merely create inconvenience. It severed connections. Neighbors who lived only a short distance away could suddenly become inaccessible. Communication slowed dramatically. Assistance became harder to obtain. People increasingly depended upon their own resources. That isolation intensified every challenge. If someone became seriously ill, help might never arrive. If livestock escaped, recovery could prove impossible. If food supplies diminished unexpectedly, options were limited. Many Viking deaths resulted not from spectacular disasters, but from small problems that gradually worsened over weeks and months. One cold morning, Eirik ventured outside before sunrise. The sky remained dark. Winter daylight was scarce at these northern latitudes. During certain periods, only a few hours of weak sunlight illuminated the landscape. For communities accustomed to agricultural labor, this posed serious difficulties. Less daylight meant less opportunity to work. Tasks required more time. Travel became riskier. Psychological strain increased. Many historians believe the darkness itself represented a significant burden upon Viking populations. Humans are not naturally adapted to months of limited sunlight. Fatigue increased. Morale declined. The world seemed smaller, colder, more confined. As Eirik crossed the farmyard, snow squeaked beneath his boots. His breath formed clouds in the air. He checked the livestock shelter. The animals remained alive. That alone counted as good news. Keeping livestock alive through winter was absolutely essential. Cattle represented wealth. Sheep provided wool. Goats supplied milk. Losing animals could devastate a household's future, yet feeding them required enormous quantities of stored hay. Every day, animals consumed resources that could never be replaced until spring. Farmers constantly balanced competing priorities: feed the livestock, preserve human food supplies, conserve fuel, maintain shelter, avoid waste. The calculations never ended. Weeks passed. The sea froze along sheltered edges. Ice formed across streams. Snow continued accumulating. Life settled into a repetitive rhythm. Morning chores, animal care, repair work, food preparation, storytelling, sleep, then repeat. From a modern perspective, such routine might appear peaceful. Sometimes it was, but beneath that routine lurked constant anxiety. Would supplies remain sufficient? Would illness strike? Would storms intensify? Would spring arrive before resources disappeared? No one knew. One evening, while snow fell gently outside, an elderly traveler arrived at the farm. The man had journeyed from another settlement farther north. His face revealed exhaustion. His beard carried ice crystals. His clothing showed signs of hard travel. Eirik welcomed him inside. Hospitality occupied an important place within Viking culture. Travelers often depended upon the generosity of strangers. Refusing assistance could place someone's life at risk. The visitor accepted warm food and a place beside the fire. Gradually, conversation began. The traveler shared troubling news. Several farms farther north had already experienced shortages. A particularly poor harvest, combined with early storms, had created serious difficulties. Families were slaughtering livestock earlier than planned. Food reserves were shrinking. Some settlements feared starvation before winter's end. Silence filled the longhouse. Everyone understood what those words meant. Winter had barely begun, and already some communities faced danger. Outside, snow continued falling. The wind whispered against the walls. The fire crackled steadily. Yet despite the warmth inside, a chilling realization spread among those gathered around the hearth. The most dangerous months still lay ahead, and winter, relentless as ever, was only beginning its long campaign against the people who dared call these frozen lands home. The most dangerous months still lay ahead, and winter, relentless as ever, was only beginning its long campaign against the people who dared call these frozen lands home. The days that followed brought no dramatic catastrophe. No giant avalanche swept down the mountains. No invading army appeared on the horizon. No legendary sea monster emerged from the icy fjord. Instead, winter advanced in the manner that made it truly frightening. Slowly, patiently, almost invisibly. For Eirik and his family, each morning looked much like the one before. They awoke before dawn, tended the animals, checked food stores, maintained tools, and gathered around the hearth when darkness returned. At first glance, life seemed stable, yet tiny changes accumulated. The hay stacks gradually shrank. Firewood piles became slightly smaller. Barrels that once appeared full now showed empty spaces. Every meal represented resources that would never return until the warmth of spring. The household became increasingly aware of time, not by calendars, not by written records, but by supplies. Every bundle consumed marked another step toward an uncertain future. Outside, the landscape appeared frozen in place. The fjord reflected pale winter light whenever the sky cleared. Snow-covered hills, rocks, and forests, with a thick blanket of white. The world seemed motionless, yet nature remained active beneath the surface. Storms gathered far out at sea. Ice thickened across streams. Predators searched for food, and human beings continued their endless struggle against the season. One particularly cold morning, Eirik noticed something troubling. A young goat refused food. Normally energetic and restless, the animal stood quietly in a corner. Its breathing seemed labored. Its movements lacked strength. Eirik immediately recognized the danger. During winter, illness among livestock could become disastrous. Animals represented far more than food. They provided milk, wool, labor, and future generations of livestock. Losing even a few animals could weaken a farm for years. The family watched the goat closely. They offered additional care, extra bedding, shelter from drafts, warm water whenever possible. But winter rarely showed mercy. Within days, the animal died. The loss itself was not devastating. One goat would not ruin the household, yet it served as a reminder. nothing was guaranteed. The farm's survival rested upon countless fragile factors: a healthy herd, adequate food, reasonable weather, good fortune. Remove enough of those elements, and disaster could follow. As December deepened, darkness became one of the greatest challenges. The sun barely climbed above the horizon. Morning blended into afternoon. Afternoon quickly surrendered to evening. Children spent more time indoors. Adults performed necessary tasks quickly before daylight vanished. Long periods of darkness affected everyone. The human mind responds strongly to sunlight. Modern science understands this clearly, but Viking communities experienced the effects firsthand. Energy levels declined. Motivation weakened. People became quieter. Stories told around the fire gained greater importance because they helped fill endless hours of darkness. Astrid often entertained the children with tales passed down through generations. Stories of ancient heroes, stories of clever travelers, stories of gods and giants. The children listened carefully, not simply because the tales were enjoyable. The stories offered escape. For a short time, listeners could imagine distant adventures rather than the endless winter beyond the walls. Eirik participated as well. Like many fathers throughout Scandinavia, he understood that storytelling served practical purposes. Knowledge passed through stories. Traditions survived through stories. History endured through stories. During long winters, oral culture became one of the most valuable resources a community possessed. Outside, however, reality remained harsh. One afternoon, a fierce windstorm struck the region. The sky darkened unexpectedly. Snow erupted from the ground. Visibility collapsed. Even standing a few steps from the longhouse became dangerous. The storm screamed through the valley with frightening force. Timbers groaned. Roof coverings rattled. Doors shook in their frames. Inside, family members remained close together. Storms like this could continue for days, and sometimes they caused serious damage. Throughout Viking Scandinavia, many deaths occurred not because people became lost during pleasant weather, but because they underestimated sudden storms. A short trip between neighboring farms could transform into a fatal journey. Landmarks vanished. Paths disappeared. Temperatures plunged. Even experienced travelers could lose direction. The storm outside Eirik's home lasted nearly 48 hours. When calm finally returned, the world had changed once again. Snowdrifts towered against walls. Entrances required clearing. Animal shelters demanded inspection. Several fence sections had collapsed beneath accumulated snow. Repair work began immediately. Winter never allowed prolonged rest. Each challenge generated another task, and each task consumed precious energy. The months stretched onward. By midwinter, the household settled into a pattern of careful conservation. Meals became slightly smaller, not dramatically, just enough to extend supplies. No one complained. Everyone understood the necessity. Throughout history, communities surviving in harsh environments often developed remarkable discipline. Viking households were no exception. People learned to think months ahead. Immediate comfort mattered less than long-term survival. One evening, while examining stored grain, Astrid frowned. The level appeared lower than expected. Not dangerously low. Not yet, but lower. She mentioned her concern to Eirik. Together, they calculated consumption rates. The numbers were uncomfortable. If winter remained severe and spring arrived late, adjustments might become necessary. Again, the conversation remained calm. Panic solved nothing, yet both understood the implications. Food shortages rarely appeared suddenly. They developed gradually. A handful removed here, a small reduction there. Then one day people realized reserves had fallen far below expectations. Across Scandinavia, countless families faced similar calculations every winter. Most survived, some did not. The difference often depended upon factors beyond individual control: weather, harvest quality, animal health, timing, luck. Historians frequently describe Viking society as resilient, and that description is accurate. Resilience was not merely admired, it was essential. Communities incapable of enduring hardship simply vanished. Those that survived adapted generation after generation. Yet resilience did not eliminate suffering. It merely improved the chances of survival. One afternoon, several neighboring farmers arrived unexpectedly. Travel during winter remained uncommon, which immediately suggested something important. The visitors entered the longhouse, warmed themselves by the hearth, and exchanged news. The reports were mixed. Some farms continued managing reasonably well. Others faced increasing difficulties. A family farther inland had lost multiple cattle. Another settlement struggled with dwindling grain supplies. Several elderly residents had died since winter began. None of these events seemed extraordinary by themselves. Taken together, however, they painted a troubling picture. The season was exacting its usual toll, and winter was only halfway finished. The discussion eventually shifted toward memories. Older farmers compared current conditions to winters they had experienced decades earlier. One man recalled a season when snow remained on the ground well into summer. Another remembered widespread livestock deaths. A third described famine conditions that forced families to consume seed grain intended for future planting. Such memories served as warnings. Nature had delivered devastating winters before. It could do so again. After the visitors departed, Eirik spent a long time staring into the flames. His thoughts drifted toward previous generations. His father had survived difficult winters. His grandfather as well. Many had not. The Viking world often appears romantic in modern imagination. People picture adventurous voyages, magnificent ships, and fearless warriors. Those elements certainly existed, but survival remained the central challenge of everyday life. Most victories occurred quietly, a family reaching spring with sufficient food, livestock surviving until fresh grass appeared, children avoiding illness. Those successes rarely entered sagas, yet they mattered more than many battles. As January tightened its grip, temperatures dropped even further. Water froze rapidly. Wood became brittle. Metal felt painfully cold to touch. Simple outdoor tasks demanded greater effort. Breathing itself seemed sharper. The cold penetrated clothing. It seeped through walls. It settled into bones. The hearth burned constantly. Fuel consumption increased. More firewood disappeared each week. This created another difficult equation. Heat required wood. Gathering wood during winter proved challenging. Stored reserves were finite. Too much burning risked depletion. Too little invited freezing conditions. Families throughout Scandinavia constantly balanced these competing dangers. Then came another setback. A cow developed signs of illness. Unlike the goat, this animal held substantial value. Its survival mattered enormously. Eirik inspected it repeatedly. The animal remained weak. Its appetite declined. Its condition worsened. Every member of the household noticed the tension. No one spoke about it openly. There was little point. Everyone understood the stakes. For several days, the cow lingered between recovery and decline. The family hoped, waited, watched. Outside, snow continued drifting across the valley. The mountains stood silent beneath pale skies. The frozen fjord reflected faint light from the horizon. Winter remained beautiful, incredibly beautiful, but beauty offered no protection. Nature could appear breathtaking, while simultaneously threatening lives. That contradiction shaped much of Viking existence. People admired the landscape. They respected it. They feared it. And often all three emotions existed together. One morning, Eirik entered the shelter and immediately knew the outcome. The cow lay motionless. The struggle had ended. Another loss, a more serious one this time. The household gathered quietly. No dramatic displays of grief followed. Practical concerns came first. The animal's death required decisions. Resources had already become limited. Every setback mattered. And as Eirik stood in the cold air beside the shelter, he realized a difficult truth. The second half of winter was beginning to reveal its teeth. The season's greatest dangers were no longer distant possibilities discussed around the fire. They were becoming realities. And somewhere beyond the mountains, more storms were already forming, slowly moving toward the scattered farms that clung to survival along Scandinavia's frozen shores. And somewhere beyond the mountains, more storms were already forming, slowly moving toward the scattered farms that clung to survival along Scandinavia's frozen shores. The death of the cow changed the atmosphere within Eirik's household, not dramatically, not all at once, but everyone felt it. A healthy animal represented security. Its loss represented uncertainty. The farm still possessed livestock. The family still had food. No immediate crisis threatened them. Yet, winter had delivered another reminder that survival depended upon a delicate balance. One unfortunate event could be absorbed. Several could become dangerous. The days continued passing beneath low gray skies. Sometimes snow drifted gently from the clouds. Other times, fierce winds swept through the valley, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin like tiny needles. Even short journeys across the farmyard became unpleasant. People moved quickly between buildings. Doors remained closed whenever possible. Warmth became precious. Every bit of heat mattered. Inside the longhouse, life revolved around the hearth more than ever. The fire burned from morning until night. Children slept near it. Adults worked near it. Meals were prepared over it. Stories were told beside it. Without that constant flame, winter could become deadly within hours. Firewood therefore occupied a place nearly equal to food in importance. Many modern people imagine starvation as the greatest threat facing ancient societies during winter. In reality, cold often rivaled hunger as an enemy. A person can survive many days without food. Exposure to freezing temperatures can kill far more quickly. For this reason, Viking families devoted enormous effort to gathering and storing fuel before winter arrived. Yet even the best preparations sometimes proved insufficient. One evening, Eirik walked outside to inspect the woodpile. The sight concerned him. The reserve remained substantial, but not as substantial as he would have liked. The recent cold had increased consumption. The frequent storms had forced the family to spend longer periods indoors. Wood disappeared faster than expected. He stood silently for several moments. Snowflakes drifted through the darkness. Above him, faint stars appeared between moving clouds. The beauty of the night contrasted sharply with his thoughts. Calculations filled his mind. How many weeks remained until spring? How much wood remained? How much could safely be used? Questions like these occupied countless Viking farmers throughout every winter. Unlike modern households, they could not simply increase heating when temperatures fell. Every extra log burned represented a resource permanently gone. Back inside, Astrid noticed his expression immediately. Years of shared hardship had taught them to recognize concerns without words. She asked about the wood supply. Eirik answered honestly. Not alarming. Not yet, but worth monitoring carefully. Astrid nodded. That was often the nature of winter problems. They rarely appeared as sudden disasters. Instead, they developed gradually, forcing families to make increasingly difficult decisions. As February approached, another challenge emerged. Illness, not a deadly plague, not a dramatic epidemic, simply the ordinary sicknesses that accompanied long months spent in close quarters. One of the younger children developed a persistent cough, then another. Soon, several members of the household showed similar symptoms. In the modern world, such illnesses might seem minor. For Viking families, they demanded serious attention. Medical knowledge existed, but remained limited. Herbal remedies could help. Rest could help. Luck often helped most. Even relatively simple infections occasionally became fatal, especially among the very young or very old. Astrid prepared remedies passed down through generations. Warm drinks, medicinal herbs, various treatments learned from parents and grandparents. The family hoped for improvement. Fortunately, after several difficult days, the children began recovering. Relief spread through the household. Yet the episode highlighted another reality of Viking winters. The season weakened people. Limited sunlight, restricted diets, cold temperatures, crowded living conditions, all combined to create opportunities for illness. Across Scandinavia, many families were not as fortunate. A fever that seems manageable today could become a death sentence 1,000 years ago. The arrival of sickness often frightened communities as much as storms, perhaps more. Storms eventually passed. Disease sometimes lingered. One afternoon, Eirik traveled to a neighboring farm. The journey was necessary. Two families planned to exchange supplies and information. Such cooperation often improved survival chances. The trip itself demonstrated winter's challenges. The distance was not great. During summer, he could have covered it quickly. Winter transformed the experience entirely. Snow concealed landmarks. Ice created hazards. Progress slowed considerably. The landscape appeared familiar, yet strangely altered. Fields vanished beneath white blankets. Paths disappeared. Even hills seemed different. When Eirik finally arrived, he found the neighboring household facing difficulties. Their food situation remained stable. Their livestock remained mostly healthy, but an elderly family member had recently died. The old man had survived many winters. He had witnessed decades of change. He had watched children become parents and parents become grandparents. Yet this winter had proven one season too many. Death during winter was common enough that few considered it surprising. Nevertheless, each loss carried weight. Every elder represented knowledge, accumulated across a lifetime. Farming techniques, weather patterns, family histories, stories, practical wisdom. When an elder died, an entire library vanished with them. That evening, the neighboring families shared memories of the old man. Not grand achievements, not famous deeds, simple recollections. advice he had given, mistakes he had made, humorous incidents from years past. Such conversations reflected an important aspect of Viking culture. Community mattered. Individual households might survive alone for a time. Long-term survival depended upon cooperation. People exchanged labor, shared information, provided assistance, offered hospitality. Without these networks, winter became far more dangerous. The following morning, Eirik returned home. Fresh snow had fallen overnight. The world appeared untouched, silent, pristine, almost magical. Yet beneath that beauty remained countless struggles. Every farm concealed worries. Every household faced challenges. No one knew precisely how neighboring families were managing. People shared what they could, but many hardships remained private. As weeks passed, the psychological burden of winter became increasingly noticeable. The darkness persisted, the cold persisted, the confinement persisted. Days blended together. For children, the season often felt endless. For adults, responsibilities never ceased. Many historians believe modern people underestimate the mental strain ancient winters imposed. Humans evolved in social environments rich with activity and movement. Viking winters restricted both. Travel became difficult. Outdoor work diminished. Opportunities for variety decreased. The result could be a profound sense of monotony. To combat this, families remained busy whenever possible. Tools required maintenance. Clothing required repair. Ropes needed weaving. Household items demanded attention. Idleness represented both a practical and psychological threat. Work occupied hands. It also occupied minds. One night, as wind rattled the walls once again, Eirik listened to the sounds of the longhouse, the crackle of fire, the breathing of sleeping children, the occasional movement of livestock sheltered nearby. These sounds reassured him. Life continued. The household endured. Yet he also understood how fragile that endurance remained. Winter was not finished. Far from it. In many years, the final weeks proved more dangerous than the first. Food stores reached their lowest levels. People became exhausted. Animals weakened. Patience wore thin. The period between late winter and early spring often earned a grim reputation throughout northern Europe. In some regions, it became known as the hunger season. The reason was simple. Supplies from the previous harvest approached exhaustion. New food sources had not yet appeared. Families occupied a difficult middle ground, not fully starving, not fully secure. The coming weeks would test everyone. One afternoon, another traveler arrived at the farm. Like the visitor earlier in the season, he carried news from distant settlements. This time, the reports were worse. Several communities farther north had experienced severe shortages. Livestock losses were increasing. Food reserves were dangerously low. A few families had reportedly abandoned farms altogether, seeking refuge with relatives elsewhere. Such decisions were never taken lightly. Leaving a farm meant abandoning years of labor, fields, buildings, animals, memories, yet desperation sometimes left no alternative. The traveler also described coastal settlements where fishing had become difficult due to ice and storms. Normally, the sea provided an important supplement to winter diets. When access to those resources disappeared, hardship intensified rapidly. Eirik listened carefully. The stories troubled him, not because his own family faced immediate danger, but because they demonstrated how quickly circumstances could change. One poor harvest, one severe winter, one string of unfortunate events. That was often enough. As darkness settled that evening, he stepped outside once more. The air felt brutally cold. Above him stretched a sky crowded with stars. The northern lights shimmered faintly along the horizon, casting ghostly colors across the frozen landscape. Many Vikings viewed such displays with awe. Some saw spiritual significance. Others simply admired their beauty. Eirik watched silently. The lights danced across the heavens, while snow-covered mountains stood like ancient guardians around the valley. For a moment, everything appeared peaceful, timeless, almost gentle. Then a sharp wind swept through the darkness. The illusion vanished. The cold bit through his clothing. Winter reminded him once again of its true nature. Beautiful, powerful, indifferent, and as February slowly moved toward its final weeks, a new problem was beginning to emerge across Scandinavia. Food was becoming scarce. Not everywhere, not yet, but in enough places to cause concern. The season had already claimed animals, elders, and valuable resources. Soon it would begin testing something even more fundamental: the ability of ordinary people to endure hunger. While waiting for a spring that still seemed frustratingly far away, the ability of ordinary people to endure hunger. While waiting for a spring that still seemed frustratingly far away. By the time the first hints of late winter arrived, many Viking households had entered the most difficult stage of the year. The excitement of autumn harvests was a distant memory. The novelty of the first snowfall had long vanished. Even the celebrations that sometimes brightened the darkest weeks of winter had passed. What remained was endurance. Simple, exhausting endurance. Eirik noticed it in small ways. The children asked more frequently when spring would come. Astrid spent longer examining food stores before preparing meals. Neighbors discussed supplies more often than weather. Everyone seemed to be counting days, not because they knew exactly when warmer temperatures would arrive, because they desperately hoped they would arrive soon. The longhouse remained the center of life. Its familiar smells filled the air: wood smoke, cooked fish, wool clothing drying near the fire. animals sheltered nearby. The scent was not particularly pleasant by modern standards, yet to those living there, it represented safety. Outside lay snow, ice, darkness, and uncertainty. Inside lay warmth and survival. The contrast could not have been greater. One morning, Eirik opened a storage barrel and stared quietly into it. The dried fish remained plentiful enough. That was encouraging, but the grain supply had declined noticeably. He already knew this. Everyone knew it. Still, seeing the level fall lower each week created an uncomfortable feeling. The household was not starving. Meals continued. No one went entirely without food. Yet portions had gradually become smaller than those served months earlier. Nobody complained. Complaining wasted energy. Besides, every family across the region faced similar realities. Winter was designed to consume resources. That was its nature. The challenge lay in ensuring resources lasted longer than the season itself. Across Scandinavia, some households had begun slaughtering additional livestock. This decision created a difficult trade-off. Killing animals provided immediate food. Keeping them alive preserved future wealth. A cow could produce milk. A sheep could provide wool. Animals could reproduce and strengthen a family's position in years ahead. But future benefits mattered little if people failed to survive the present winter. Many families therefore faced painful choices. Protect tomorrow or survive today. Historians studying Viking settlements have found evidence suggesting that these decisions occurred regularly. The archaeological record often reveals patterns consistent with winter slaughtering. Communities adapted as circumstances demanded. Practicality frequently outweighed sentiment. One afternoon, Eirik joined several neighbors to discuss conditions throughout the valley. The gathering was informal. No chief presided. No official meeting had been called. People simply needed information. Winter encouraged cooperation. Knowledge could be almost as valuable as food. The news proved mixed. Some farms remained stable. Others struggled. One family had experienced repeated livestock losses. Another had exhausted most of its grain supply earlier than expected. A few households relied increasingly on preserved fish. Others depended heavily upon stored dairy products. No two situations were identical, yet everyone shared a common concern. Would their supplies last until spring grazing began? No one could answer confidently. The uncertainty itself became part of daily life. As the conversation continued, one elderly farmer spoke about a winter from his youth. His voice carried the quiet authority of experience. He described a season when storms continued far longer than expected. Snow remained deep well into spring. Livestock died in large numbers. Food shortages spread across multiple settlements. Several families never recovered. The younger listeners remained silent. Stories like these served a purpose. They reminded people that current hardships, however unpleasant, could always become worse. Winter possessed many degrees of severity. Some years tested communities, other years broke them. Fortunately, Irix Valley had not yet reached that point, yet no one felt comfortable assuming it never would. Days continued passing beneath pale skies. The sun climbed slightly higher than before. Not much, just enough for observant people to notice. The change lifted spirits. Winter still dominated the landscape, but signs of progress existed. Every additional minute of daylight felt significant. For people who had endured months of darkness, even small improvements mattered. Children noticed first. They often do. One evening, Irix's youngest son pointed toward the horizon and excitedly declared that daylight seemed to last longer. The adults smiled. He was correct. Not by much, but enough. The observation sparked conversation around the hearth. People discussed approaching spring, as though speaking of a distant friend, still far away, yet gradually drawing nearer. Hope represented an important survival tool, perhaps not in the physical sense. Hope could not fill an empty stomach. It could not warm frozen hands, yet it strengthened resolve. People who believed winter would eventually end often endured hardships more effectively than those who surrendered to despair. The Vikings understood this, even if they lacked modern psychological terminology. Morale mattered. Stories mattered. Community mattered. One evening, a fierce storm returned unexpectedly. The wind howled across the valley with such intensity that sleep became difficult. Snow struck the walls relentlessly. Roof timbers groaned. The sound seemed endless. Hour after hour, night after night. When morning finally arrived, the storm still raged. The world beyond the longhouse disappeared completely. Even experienced farmers hesitated to venture outdoors. Visibility had collapsed. The air itself seemed alive with swirling snow. For 3 days, the storm continued. 3 long days. Inside, people remained confined. Food consumption increased slightly because everyone stayed indoors. Firewood disappeared more rapidly. Patience wore thin. Children became restless. Adults became tired. The storm transformed the longhouse into a small island surrounded by a sea of white chaos. When calm weather eventually returned, the valley looked unfamiliar. Massive drifts covered portions of buildings. Paths vanished again. Several structures required immediate attention. Throughout Scandinavia, storms like this occasionally proved deadly. Roofs collapsed. Travelers became trapped. Animals suffocated beneath snow. Entire communities could find themselves isolated for weeks. Irix Farm escaped serious damage. Others were less fortunate. News soon arrived that a neighboring settlement had lost several sheep during the storm. Another household suffered structural damage to a storage building. Such reports reinforced a difficult truth. Even after months of winter, danger remained constant. Experience provided no immunity. Nature always retained the upper hand. As March approached, another challenge emerged. The animals grew weaker, not dramatically, but noticeably. Stored hay remained available, yet winter feed could never fully replace fresh grazing. The livestock had spent months indoors. Their bodies reflected it. They moved more slowly, appeared thinner, consumed resources that continued shrinking. Farmers watched carefully. The survival of livestock often determined how quickly a family recovered once winter ended. A household entering spring with healthy animals possessed advantages. Milk production could resume. Breeding could continue. Agricultural work became easier. Those who lost too many animals faced difficulties, extending far beyond a single season. One morning, Eirik inspected the remaining cattle and felt a cautious sense of relief. Despite the earlier loss, most remained alive. Thin, certainly, but alive. After everything winter had already taken, that counted as success. The standards of survival often differed from modern expectations. Today, success might mean growth, expansion, improvement. For many Viking families, success sometimes meant simply reaching spring with enough resources intact to continue. That was achievement enough. The weeks dragged onward. Snow still covered the landscape. Ice still gripped the fjord. Cold winds still swept down from the mountains. Yet subtle changes accumulated. Birds occasionally appeared. The sun lingered longer. Temperatures occasionally rose above freezing during daylight hours. Water dripped from rooftops. These signs generated excitement disproportionate to their size, because they represented possibility. Winter remained powerful, but it was no longer advancing. At last, it had begun retreating. The realization spread slowly throughout the valley. People stood outside longer. Conversations carried a different tone. The future seemed imaginable again. Yet experienced farmers remained cautious. They knew better than to celebrate too early. Some of the worst hardships occurred during the transition between winter and spring. Food supplies often reached their lowest levels precisely when hope returned. The season's final blows could arrive unexpectedly. A late storm, a prolonged freeze, another livestock illness. Nature had many ways to remind people not to become complacent. One evening, as the family gathered around the fire, Eirik reflected upon the months behind them. The winter had already claimed a valuable cow, consumed enormous quantities of food and fuel, restricted movement, tested patience, threatened health, and still it was not finished. The Vikings often viewed life through the lens of struggle and resilience, not because they enjoyed hardship, because hardship surrounded them. Every season presented challenges. Winter simply concentrated them into one long, relentless trial. Outside, melting snow dripped from parts of the roof during daylight, then froze again at night. The cycle repeated endlessly. The landscape occupied an awkward state between seasons, neither fully winter nor fully spring. Many people considered this period especially frustrating. The destination appeared visible, yet remained out of reach. And as Eirik prepared for another night beside the hearth, reports began arriving from farther north. Reports describing a hunger far worse than anything his valley had yet experienced. Entire communities were entering desperate conditions. Food reserves had nearly vanished. Families were making choices they hoped never to face. The true horror of Viking winters was revealing itself elsewhere across Scandinavia, and those stories, carried south by weary travelers, would soon remind everyone just how deadly the season could become when preparation, luck, and nature failed to align. And those stories, carried south by weary travelers, would soon remind everyone just how deadly the season could become when preparation, luck, and nature failed to align. The first traveler arrived shortly after a rare day of sunshine. The sky had remained clear for several hours, allowing weak sunlight to illuminate the valley. For a brief moment, the world appeared brighter than it had in months. Then the stranger appeared. His arrival immediately attracted attention. Winter travelers were rarely casual visitors. People did not undertake difficult journeys through snow and ice without reason. The man looked exhausted. His clothing showed signs of hard travel. His face carried the expression of someone who had witnessed troubling things. Eirik welcomed him into the longhouse. A place near the fire was offered. Warm food followed. Only after the traveler had rested did conversation begin. The news he carried spread a heavy silence throughout the room. Farther north, conditions had deteriorated badly. Several coastal settlements had exhausted much of their food supply. Fishing had become unreliable. Storms had prevented boats from reaching productive waters. In some areas, ice had blocked access to traditional fishing grounds. Communities that normally depended upon the sea now faced shortages. For generations, Viking families had viewed the ocean as both friend and enemy. The sea provided food, trade opportunities, transportation, wealth, yet during severe winters, it could suddenly become inaccessible. When that happened, entire communities lost one of their most important lifelines. The traveler described villages where meals had become painfully small. Families stretched every resource. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled repeatedly to extract nourishment. Preserved food was rationed carefully. People counted supplies day by day. As he spoke, nobody interrupted. Everyone listened, not because they enjoyed hearing such stories, because these stories represented reality, a reality that could eventually reach any settlement. even those currently managing well. The traveler remained for several days before continuing south. When he departed, he left behind more than information. He left behind perspective. Eirik's family still possessed food, still possessed shelter, still possessed hope. Others possessed far less. That realization lingered. The following week brought unusual weather. Temperatures rose slightly, not enough to end winter, but enough to alter the landscape. Icicles formed along rooftops. Snow softened during daylight. Small streams of meltwater appeared in sheltered locations. For many people, these signs felt encouraging, yet experienced farmers understood the dangers. The transition from winter to spring could be deceptive. A few warm days often encouraged optimism. Then another snowstorm would arrive and erase that optimism entirely. Nature moved according to its own schedule. Human expectations meant little. One afternoon, while checking a storage building, Eirik noticed another problem. Moisture, the changing temperatures, had introduced damp conditions into part of the structure. A portion of stored food required immediate inspection. Mold represented a serious threat. Spoilage could destroy precious supplies. The family spent hours examining storage containers. Fortunately, most remained unaffected. Yet the incident highlighted another challenge rarely discussed in heroic tales of Viking life. Winter was not merely cold. It was complicated. Food could freeze. Food could spoil. Buildings could weaken. Animals could sicken. Every aspect of survival demanded attention. Success required constant vigilance. As March continued, travelers became slightly more common. Improving conditions made movement easier. News traveled more freely, and much of that news painted a grim picture of conditions elsewhere. Several settlements reportedly experienced outright hunger. Not discomfort, not reduced portions, real hunger, the kind that forces people to think about food constantly, the kind that weakens the body, the kind that changes behavior. Modern people living in developed societies rarely experience prolonged food scarcity. For Viking communities, it remained a recurring threat. Most years, families avoided starvation through preparation and cooperation. But preparation sometimes failed, and nature sometimes overwhelmed even the best plans. One traveler described a community where livestock losses had become severe. Animals weakened from insufficient feed. Several died before spring. Others were slaughtered because families could no longer support them. The immediate result provided food. The long-term consequences would linger for years. A farm without animals struggled to recover. Livestock represented wealth in its most practical form. Losing them meant losing future opportunities. As these stories circulated, Eirik found himself reflecting upon the generations who had lived before him. How many winters had they endured? How many hardships had gone unrecorded? The sagas celebrated explorers and warriors, but countless unnamed families had fought quieter battles, battles against weather, against hunger, against isolation. Their victories rarely appeared in stories, yet without them, Viking society could never have existed. Every surviving household represented a triumph of persistence. One evening, an elderly woman from a neighboring farm visited the longhouse. She carried knowledge accumulated across decades. People respected her wisdom. During conversation, she spoke about a winter she remembered from childhood. The details remained vivid despite the passing years. Snow had fallen relentlessly. Food became scarce. Several families left the region entirely. Children died. Elders died. Animals disappeared. When spring finally arrived, entire farms stood abandoned. The room fell quiet. No one doubted her account. Stories like these appeared throughout Scandinavian history. The climate could be unforgiving. A sequence of poor seasons occasionally pushed communities beyond their limits. The elderly woman then said something that remained with Eirik long after she departed. She explained that winter rarely defeated people in a single blow. Instead, it wore them down, little by little, day after day, storm after storm, meal after meal, until eventually there was nothing left to spare. The observation felt accurate. Winter was not usually dramatic. It was relentless, and relentless things can be more dangerous than sudden disasters. As April approached, the valley experienced longer periods of daylight. The difference became unmistakable. Children spent more time outdoors. Farmers inspected fields whenever conditions allowed. People discussed future planting seasons. Hope returned cautiously, yet food supplies had reached their lowest levels. This was the cruel irony of late winter. The signs of spring appeared precisely when resources were most depleted. Many families faced their greatest hardship at the very moment conditions seemed to be improving. Eirik's household remained careful. Meals continued to be measured. Nothing was wasted. The family understood that optimism could not replace food. Several weeks still separated them from genuine abundance. The livestock also sensed change. Animals became more active. They responded to longer daylight, to subtle shifts in temperature, to the promise of grazing lands hidden beneath the snow. But promise alone could not sustain them. Every day remained a challenge. One morning, Eirik climbed a nearby rise overlooking the valley. The journey required effort. Snow still covered much of the landscape. Yet from that vantage point, he could see evidence of transformation. Dark patches of earth appeared in some locations. The fjord showed increasing areas of open water. Streams flowed more freely. Winter's grip was weakening. Slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably, the sight filled him with relief. Not celebration. Relief because surviving winter often felt less like achieving victory and more like escaping defeat. The distinction mattered. No one conquered winter. People merely endured it, and those who endured long enough eventually witnessed its retreat. Back at the farm, preparations for spring began cautiously. Tools required inspection. Fields required planning. Repairs demanded attention. The work served another purpose as well. It reminded people that life extended beyond winter, that future harvests remained possible, that another season waited ahead. Throughout history, hope often arrived not through grand speeches, but through practical tasks. Planting, repairing, preparing. Such actions represented faith in tomorrow. Yet, while Irix Valley slowly emerged from winter, the stories arriving from farther north grew increasingly severe. Some communities had suffered losses far beyond livestock and supplies. People themselves had begun to perish from the cumulative effects of hunger, illness, and exposure. The season's deadliest phase had reached its peak, and the travelers arriving from those regions carried accounts that revealed just how thin the line between survival and disaster truly was in the Viking world. Those accounts would soon spread throughout the valley, bringing with them sobering reminders that not everyone would live to see the spring now approaching on the horizon. Those accounts would soon spread throughout the valley, bringing with them sobering reminders that not everyone would live to see the spring now approaching on the horizon. The next travelers arrived together, a group of 3 men moving south along routes that had slowly become passable as winter loosened its grip. Their journey had taken weeks. They carried few possessions. Most of their energy had been devoted simply to reaching safer territory. When word spread that they had come from settlements far to the north, people gathered eagerly to hear news, not out of curiosity alone, because information could mean survival. The travelers spoke quietly. Their stories lacked exaggeration. They did not need embellishment. Reality was troubling enough. One settlement had entered winter already weakened by a poor harvest. Heavy rains during the previous growing season had reduced crop yields. Several livestock illnesses had followed. Then winter arrived earlier than expected. The combination proved devastating. Food reserves that should have lasted until spring began disappearing by midwinter. Families reduced portions, then reduced them again. Eventually, many households consumed nearly everything available. The travelers described people grinding together whatever remained. Bits of grain, dried plants, anything capable of providing nourishment. Meals became smaller and smaller, not because people desired restraint, because there was simply no alternative. For Viking communities, starvation rarely appeared overnight. It developed gradually. A little less food one week, a little less the next. Bodies weakened, energy faded, resistance to illness declined. Tasks that once seemed routine became exhausting. The process unfolded slowly enough that people often adapted without realizing how serious conditions had become. Then one day they looked around and saw neighbors who had become noticeably thinner, children who lacked strength, animals reduced to shadows of their former selves. The travelers also described another consequence of severe winters: migration. Families occasionally abandoned farms that could no longer support them. This decision carried enormous weight. A farm represented years of labor, generations of memories, buildings constructed by fathers and grandfathers, fields cleared by countless hours of work. Leaving such a place was heartbreaking, yet survival came first. Some families packed whatever possessions they could carry and sought refuge with relatives. Others traveled toward settlements rumored to possess greater resources. Not everyone succeeded. Travel during late winter remained dangerous. Exhausted people faced difficult conditions. Some never completed the journey. As these stories circulated through Irix Valley, gratitude mixed with concern. The local situation remained difficult but manageable. Others had suffered far worse. The contrast served as a reminder. Survival often depended upon factors beyond personal effort. Hard work mattered. Preparation mattered. Yet luck also played a role. A favorable harvest, healthier animals, slightly milder weather. Small differences sometimes determined whether a community prospered or struggled. One evening, after the travelers had departed, Eirik sat outside the longhouse, watching the fading daylight. The sun lingered, noticeably longer now. Weeks earlier darkness would already have covered the valley. Now golden light still touched distant mountain slopes. The sight felt almost unfamiliar. Winter had lasted so long that people needed time to remember what longer days looked like. Nearby, water dripped steadily from melting snow. The sound echoed softly across the farm, drop after drop, a simple noise, yet one filled with significance. Every drop represented winter losing ground. The season remained dangerous, but its strength was fading. Inside the longhouse, preparations for the coming agricultural season continued. Tools were repaired. Plans were discussed. Seed grain was carefully protected. Nothing could be planted yet. The ground remained frozen in many places. Still, preparation itself boosted morale. Human beings often cope better with hardship when moving toward a goal. Spring provided that goal. Each task completed represented another step toward renewal. Astrid noticed the change in mood as well. The children laughed more frequently. Conversations felt lighter. Even the animals appeared more active. Life was beginning to emerge from months of confinement. Yet winter delivered one final reminder that it remained dangerous. A late season storm struck unexpectedly, not as severe as some earlier storms, but strong enough to create problems. Heavy snow fell throughout an entire day and night. Fresh drifts covered newly exposed ground. Paths vanished once again. The valley briefly returned to a winter appearance. Many people felt discouraged, not because the storm created catastrophic damage, because it delayed progress. After months of hardship, patience had become scarce. Everyone wanted spring. Everyone wanted movement. Everyone wanted the long struggle to end. Instead, winter reminded them that nature followed its own timetable. The storm passed after 2 days. Sunshine returned, and this time, the snow melted more quickly than before. The season no longer possessed enough strength to hold the landscape entirely in its grasp. Gradually, the valley transformed. Dark earth expanded across hillsides. Streams grew larger. Birdsong became increasingly common. The first signs of genuine spring finally appeared. For Viking communities, these changes carried immense significance. Spring meant opportunity, fresh grazing, new fishing conditions, agricultural work, improved travel, the reopening of connections between settlements. Life expanded outward once more. During winter, existence narrowed. People focused upon immediate survival. Spring allowed them to think ahead again. One morning, Eirik walked to the edge of a field that had remained hidden beneath snow for months. The ground appeared muddy and uneven, not especially impressive. Yet he smiled, because he understood what it represented. Possibility. Soon planting would begin. Soon animals could graze. Soon the cycle that sustained Viking society would start anew. Generations before him had experienced the same feeling. Generations after him would as well. The rhythm remained remarkably consistent. Preparation, growth, harvest, winter, then repeat. The success of each stage influenced the next. A poor harvest often created a difficult winter. A difficult winter often complicated spring recovery. Everything connected. This interdependence shaped Viking life in profound ways. Modern societies often separate food production from daily existence. Most people rarely think about the origins of their meals. For Viking families, survival remained directly connected to the land, weather, and seasons. Every harvest mattered. Every animal mattered. Every decision carried consequences. As conditions improved, travelers brought additional news from distant regions. Some settlements had survived severe shortages. Others had not. The stories varied, yet a common theme emerged. Communities that cooperated generally fared better than those that attempted to endure hardship alone. Families shared resources. Neighbors exchanged assistance. Relatives offered shelter. These networks often made the difference between survival and tragedy. The image of Vikings as fiercely independent warriors contains some truth, yet their survival frequently depended upon cooperation. No individual could defeat winter alone. communities endured it together. One afternoon, Eirik helped a neighboring farmer repair damage caused by months of snow and ice. The work was tiring, but satisfying. Each repaired structure symbolized recovery, evidence that another season had been survived. As they worked, the two men discussed the winter now ending. Neither described it as easy. Neither described it as disastrous. It had simply been winter, demanding, relentless, unforgiving, like so many winters before it. That observation revealed something important. The deadliest Viking winters were not necessarily rare events remembered for centuries. Rather, danger existed every year. Even relatively ordinary winters carried risks. The difference lay in degree. Some seasons strained communities. Others devastated them. All required respect. As April continued, more livestock ventured outdoors for limited periods. The animals eagerly explored patches of exposed ground. Their excitement mirrored that of their owners. Months of confinement were ending. Fresh food sources gradually returned. The landscape awakened. Life expanded, and yet traces of winter remained visible everywhere. Food stores sat nearly empty. Wood reserves had been heavily depleted. Several families mourned recent losses. Recovery would take time. Surviving winter represented only the first step. Rebuilding after winter represented the second. Many modern depictions of Viking life focus upon moments of action. Raids, exploration, battles, great voyages. Those events certainly occurred. But for most people, the greatest annual challenge remained astonishingly simple. Stay alive until spring. Everything else depended upon accomplishing that goal. As Eirik watched cattle grazing on one of the first suitable patches of land, he felt something rare. Confidence, not complete certainty. Nature never allowed that. But confidence. The worst seemed to be behind them. Winter had taken its share. Yet the household endured. The farm endured. The valley endured. Many others had not been so fortunate. And as more detailed accounts emerged from northern settlements, people throughout the region began to understand the full scale of suffering that some communities had experienced. The stories revealed not only hunger and cold, but also the hidden psychological burden of winters that seemed endless, a burden that could break spirits long before it broke bodies. The stories revealed not only hunger and cold, but also the hidden psychological burden of winters that seemed endless, a burden that could break spirits long before it broke bodies. When modern people imagine survival, they often think first of physical necessities: food, water, shelter, warmth. Those things were undeniably essential. Without them, no Viking family could hope to endure a northern winter. Yet the travelers arriving from distant settlements increasingly spoke about another struggle, one that could not be measured in barrels of grain or stacks of firewood. The struggle to maintain hope, the struggle to wake each morning and continue despite months of hardship, the struggle to believe that spring would eventually arrive. For many communities, this challenge became especially severe during the final stretch of winter. The season seemed endless. Days blurred together. Snow covered the same hills week after week. The same winds rattled the same walls. The same concerns returned every evening. Food, animals, weather, illness, survival. People became tired in ways that sleep alone could not fix. Their bodies were exhausted. Their minds were exhausted. Their patience was exhausted. One traveler described a settlement where several families had simply stopped planning for the future, not because they lacked intelligence, not because they lacked courage, because months of hardship had drained their optimism. They focused only on the next day, then the day after that, then the day after that. Eventually, even simple tasks felt overwhelming. The account fascinated Eirik, not because it seemed unusual, because it seemed understandable. He had felt glimpses of the same thing himself. During the darkest weeks of winter, even minor setbacks could feel much larger than they truly were. A broken tool, a sick animal, a damaged roof, problems that might seem manageable during summer could become deeply discouraging during February. The environment amplified everything. Long before psychologists studied seasonal depression, northern communities understood its effects through experience. They simply described it differently. People became withdrawn, quieter, less energetic, less hopeful. The symptoms were familiar, even if the language was different. One elderly farmer in the valley often remarked that winter attacked the mind as much as the body. Many years of experience had convinced him of this truth. The longer Eirik considered it, the more accurate it seemed. After all, winter rarely killed people suddenly. It wore them down, day by day, storm by storm, setback by setback. A person's determination could become another resource that needed careful preservation. Much like food, much like firewood. One evening, while sitting near the hearth, Astrid noticed that the children seemed more cheerful than they had been weeks earlier. The reason was obvious. The daylight had returned. Not completely, but enough. The change affected everyone. People lingered outdoors longer. Neighbors visited more often. Conversations sounded livelier. The valley itself felt different. Hope, it turned out, was surprisingly responsive to sunlight. As spring advanced, evidence of winter's retreat appeared everywhere. Snow receded from lower elevations. Streams rushed with meltwater. Birds returned in increasing numbers. The fjord displayed larger stretches of open water. Fishing activity slowly resumed. Each improvement generated additional optimism, yet reminders of winter remained impossible to ignore. One neighboring family had lost nearly half their livestock. Another had consumed much of the seed grain intended for planting. Several households mourned relatives who would never see another spring. Recovery would not happen overnight. The end of winter did not erase its consequences. In many ways, the season continued shaping lives long after the snow disappeared. This reality became particularly visible during community gatherings. As travel became easier, people visited one another more frequently. News spread rapidly. Stories spread rapidly. Every settlement possessed its own account of the winter. Some stories were encouraging. Others were tragic. Together, they created a broader picture of life across Viking Scandinavia. The pattern was clear. Communities that entered winter with strong harvests generally fared better. Communities weakened by poor harvests often suffered greatly. But even this was not a guarantee. Weather retained the ability to surprise everyone. One region might experience relatively manageable conditions, while another endured disaster. Geography mattered enormously. A valley sheltered from severe winds could survive comfortably, while a more exposed settlement struggled. The difference between survival and catastrophe sometimes came down to factors impossible to control. This unpredictability shaped Viking attitudes toward nature. People respected the environment because they understood its power, not in an abstract sense, in a deeply personal sense. Nature determined whether families ate well or went hungry, whether animals survived, whether travel remained possible, whether communities prospered or declined. The relationship was constant, and it demanded humility. One afternoon, Eirik traveled with several neighbors to inspect fields damaged by winter conditions. The ground remained soft and uneven. Some fences required repair. Drainage channels needed attention. The work ahead was substantial, yet nobody complained. Compared to winter survival, spring labor felt almost welcome. Hard work carried a sense of purpose. Every repaired fence, every prepared field, every completed task moved the community closer to the next harvest. And the next harvest represented security. Security against another winter. Because even as spring advanced, people already thought about the season that would eventually return. The cycle never stopped. Preparation for next winter began almost immediately after surviving the current one. Such thinking may seem unusual today, yet it made perfect sense. Viking society existed within a rhythm dictated by nature. Those who ignored that rhythm often paid a heavy price. As weeks passed, the livestock recovered gradually. Fresh grazing strengthened animals weakened by months indoors. The transformation proved remarkable. Creatures that had appeared tired and thin during late winter slowly regained energy. Their improvement lifted spirits throughout the valley. Healthy animals meant opportunity. Milk production increased. future breeding became possible. Economic recovery began. Every surviving cow, sheep, and goat represented a step toward stability. One evening, a gathering took place at a nearby farm. Families shared food, stories, and news. The atmosphere felt noticeably different from the mood of midwinter. Laughter returned more easily. People discussed future plans. Children played outdoors until daylight faded. The contrast highlighted something important. Winter had not only restricted physical movement, it had restricted social life. Spring restored those connections. Communities became communities again. For months, survival had forced people inward. Now they could look outward once more. During the gathering, one older man summarized the winter in a way that resonated deeply with everyone present. He said that winter always asked the same question. The question was not whether people were strong, not whether they were brave. The question was whether they had prepared enough. The observation sparked thoughtful silence, because preparation truly lay at the heart of Viking survival. Hard work during summer, careful planning during autumn, conservation during winter. These habits often determined outcomes. The deadliest winters frequently exposed weaknesses created months earlier. A poor harvest, insufficient firewood, too few preserved supplies. Small mistakes could become major problems once snow covered the land. Yet everyone also recognized the limits of preparation. No amount of planning could guarantee success. Sometimes storms were unusually severe. Sometimes disease struck. Sometimes harvests failed despite tremendous effort. Nature always retained the final word. As the season progressed, travelers continued bringing stories from farther north. Several settlements had experienced losses so significant that recovery might require years. Some farms stood abandoned. Others struggled to rebuild livestock populations. Entire communities faced uncertain futures. The stories served as warnings. Future generations would hear them, remember them, learn from them. Human beings often preserve lessons through stories, especially lessons purchased at great cost. The Vikings were no different. Around countless hearths, tales of difficult winters became part of local memory, not merely because people enjoyed storytelling, because those stories contained practical wisdom, warnings, advice, experience, knowledge capable of helping others survive. One morning, while standing beside a stream swollen with meltwater, Eirik reflected upon everything the valley had endured. The hunger, the storms, the uncertainty, the losses, the waiting. Winter had demanded patience, discipline, cooperation, and endurance. It had tested every household, some more severely than others. Yet the community remained, scarred perhaps, weakened in places, but still present. That alone represented a victory, a quiet victory, the kind rarely celebrated in sagas. yet perhaps more important than many famous battles, because survival allowed everything else to continue. Families, traditions, farms, communities, life itself. The stream rushed past, carrying melted snow toward the fjord. The sound felt almost symbolic. Winter's strength was flowing away. Spring now held the advantage. But as Eirik watched the water disappear downstream, he knew another truth as well. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the valleys and fjords, beyond the mountains and forests, families were still counting the cost of the season that had just ended. And the deeper historians look into Viking history, the more evidence they uncover that some winters became so devastating they reshaped entire communities, altered settlement patterns, and left marks that endured for generations long after the snow itself had melted away. And the deeper historians look into Viking history, the more evidence they uncover that some winters became so devastating they reshaped entire communities, altered settlement patterns, and left marks that endured for generations long after the snow itself had melted away. For Eirik and the people of his valley, spring was finally becoming a reality. The snowline retreated farther up the mountains. With each passing week, streams rushed with energy. Birds filled the air with sounds absent for months. The landscape seemed to awaken from a long sleep. Yet while nature renewed itself, people remained occupied with the consequences of winter. Survival had not been free. It never was. Every household carried some burden from the season. Some had lost livestock. Others had depleted food reserves. A few mourned family members who would never again walk the valley paths. The deadliest Viking winters left scars that extended far beyond the cold itself. Recovery could take years, sometimes generations. One afternoon, a merchant arrived from a larger coastal settlement several days away. His appearance generated considerable interest. Unlike travelers who carried only stories, merchants often carried information about broader conditions across the region. They heard news from many places. They spoke with countless people. Their understanding of events often stretched far beyond a single valley. As usual, hospitality was offered. Food was shared. Conversation began. The merchant described conditions throughout several coastal regions. Some communities were recovering well. Others faced serious difficulties. A number of farms had become permanently abandoned after consecutive harsh winters. The families who once lived there had relocated elsewhere. Fields returned to wilderness. Buildings slowly decayed. Nature reclaimed what people could no longer maintain. Such stories were not unusual in Viking Scandinavia. Modern maps can create the impression that settlements remain fixed and permanent. In reality, many communities shifted over time. A farm thriving in one century might disappear in the next. Harsh winters played a significant role in those changes. A single difficult season could be survived, Several difficult seasons in succession sometimes proved impossible. The merchant also spoke about regions farther north, where conditions were generally harsher, even during ordinary years. There, the margin between success and failure often remained frighteningly thin. Growing seasons were shorter. Weather was less predictable. Agricultural opportunities were more limited. Families adapted remarkably well, yet adaptation had limits. When enough challenges arrived simultaneously, even the most resilient communities struggled. Eirik listened carefully. The stories reinforced something he had begun to understand. Winter was not merely an annual inconvenience. It acted as a powerful force shaping Viking society itself. Communities expanded during favorable periods. Communities contracted during difficult ones. Population growth depended upon survival, and survival depended heavily upon climate. Modern historians sometimes refer to this as environmental pressure. The Vikings simply called it life. One evening, while repairing a fence damaged during winter storms, Eirik found himself reflecting upon his grandfather. The old man had often spoken about winters from decades earlier. At the time, those stories seemed repetitive. Every elder possessed stories about difficult winters. Now Eirik understood why. The experiences remained unforgettable. People remembered winters because winters determined futures. A good harvest might be celebrated. A severe winter might be remembered for the rest of a person's life. Children who survived difficult seasons often carried those memories into old age. The lessons remained useful. Never waste food. Always gather extra firewood. Repair buildings before autumn. Prepare for conditions worse than expected. Such advice emerged from experience purchased at great cost. As spring progressed, work intensified throughout the valley. Fields required preparation. Livestock demanded attention. Fishing resumed. Trade routes reopened. Activity expanded rapidly. The contrast with winter felt remarkable. Only weeks' earlier survival had dominated every conversation. Now people discussed opportunities, future plans, potential harvests, summer journeys. Life once again extended beyond immediate necessity. Yet nobody forgot what had happened. Memories remained fresh. One neighboring family still struggled after losing several animals. Another continued rationing supplies because winter had nearly exhausted their reserves. Recovery occurred unevenly. Some households advanced quickly, others lagged behind. This uneven recovery represented another hidden consequence of harsh winters. The season did not affect everyone equally. Two neighboring farms might experience very different outcomes. One household entered spring relatively strong. Another entered spring weakened. Over time, these differences accumulated. Success often built upon previous success. Hardship often created additional hardship. The process could influence communities for years. One morning, a group of younger men prepared for a fishing expedition. Open water had expanded considerably. The opportunity excited everyone. Fresh fish represented more than food. It represented relief, the return of resources not dependent upon dwindling winter stores. When the boats finally departed, people watched from shore with anticipation. The sea had once again become an ally. During winter, it had often been inaccessible. Now it offered possibilities. Several days later, the boats returned successfully. The catch was substantial. Celebration spread through the valley. Not extravagant celebration, practical celebration. Fresh food arrived at exactly the right moment. The timing mattered enormously. Late winter and early spring frequently represented periods of scarcity. Every additional resource improved conditions. The success also boosted morale. People needed victories, even small ones. Surviving winter required persistence. Recovering from winter required confidence. Both mattered. As summer approached, travelers continued sharing stories from distant regions. Among the most fascinating were accounts of settlements that no longer existed, places abandoned after repeated hardships. Some had once been prosperous, others had always struggled, yet all demonstrated the same principle. Nature possessed the power to reshape human geography. Modern ruins often appear mysterious. People wonder why communities vanished. Sometimes the answer involves warfare, sometimes disease, sometimes economics, and sometimes the answer is surprisingly simple. The climate became too difficult. Winter became too costly. Survival became too uncertain. People moved elsewhere. Archaeological evidence across Scandinavia reveals examples of this process. Entire settlements occasionally shifted or disappeared. The reasons varied. Harsh winters frequently contributed. One particularly interesting story came from a traveler who had visited remote regions where local traditions preserved memories of catastrophic winters centuries earlier. The details had become mixed with legend over time, yet the central message remained consistent. Certain winters were remembered long after everyone who experienced them had died. That fact alone revealed their impact. Human memory tends to preserve extraordinary events. When communities tell stories about a winter for generations, it usually means the experience left a deep impression. Perhaps livestock perished in unusual numbers. Perhaps famine spread. Perhaps migration followed. Whatever occurred, the consequences proved significant enough to enter local tradition. Eirik found such stories fascinating, not because they described distant strangers, because they highlighted a reality shared by all northern communities. Every generation faced the same challenge. Prepare, endure, adapt, repeat. The exact circumstances changed. The fundamental struggle remained remarkably consistent. One afternoon, while walking through fields now turning green, Eirik paused to observe the transformation around him. Months earlier, this same landscape had appeared frozen and lifeless. Now plants emerged everywhere. Animals grazed peacefully. Water flowed freely. The contrast felt almost unbelievable. Nature could change dramatically within a relatively short time. The experience reminded him why winter sometimes felt endless while it lasted. Human beings naturally focus upon current conditions. During February, spring seemed impossibly distant. During June, winter seemed almost imaginary. Yet both seasons were equally real. Both would return. That certainty shaped life. Throughout the Viking world, people understood that every summer carried a hidden responsibility. Preparation, no matter how pleasant conditions became. Another winter waited beyond the horizon. The wise never forgot that. As harvest planning began, discussions frequently returned to lessons learned during the recent season. Store more hay, gather additional firewood, repair roofs earlier, preserve extra food whenever possible. The advice varied. The goal remained the same: increase survival chances next time. Because there would always be a next time. The cycle guaranteed it. And while Eirik's Valley had emerged from winter battered, but intact, historians now know that some Viking communities faced challenges far more severe than anything he had experienced. In certain years, unusual climate events triggered winters of exceptional brutality, winters that pushed entire regions toward famine, reshaped economies, disrupted trade, and forced people to confront conditions so harsh that even the toughest survivors struggled to endure them. Those extraordinary winters would become some of the most feared seasons in Scandinavian history, remembered long after ordinary winters faded from memory. Those extraordinary winters would become some of the most feared seasons in Scandinavian history, remembered long after ordinary winters faded from memory. Years passed. The difficult winter that Eirik and his family had endured slowly became another memory. Life continued. Children grew older. Fields produced new harvests. Animals multiplied. The familiar rhythm of Scandinavian life carried everyone forward. Yet the lessons remained. Every autumn, when the first frost appeared across the valley, people remembered previous winters. Every stack of firewood represented a precaution. Every barrel of preserved food represented insurance against uncertainty. Preparation had become instinct. The seasons taught harsh lessons, and those who survived tended not to forget them. By now, Eirik's oldest son, Leif, had become a young man, strong, capable, and increasingly involved in the responsibilities of farm life. He had grown up listening to stories about severe winters, stories told by parents, travelers, and elders. For him, they sometimes felt distant, almost legendary, the way young people often view hardships experienced by previous generations. He respected the stories, yet he had not personally witnessed the very worst conditions described by older people. That would soon change, because nature occasionally reminds every generation why caution exists. One summer brought unusual weather. At first, the changes seemed minor. Cooler temperatures lingered longer than expected. Rain fell frequently. Clouds dominated the sky. Farmers watched carefully. Weather mattered. Always. A few days of rain caused little concern. Several weeks attracted attention. Several months created anxiety. As the growing season continued, crops developed more slowly than usual. Fields remained wet. Hay production suffered. Harvest expectations declined. The changes were gradual, yet everyone noticed. Conversations increasingly focused upon weather, not because people enjoyed discussing it, because their future depended upon it. The eventual harvest proved disappointing, not disastrous, but disappointing. Yields fell below expectations. Hay reserves were smaller than usual. Grain stores would not be as abundant as families preferred. Throughout the valley, preparations continued. People worked hard. They preserved every resource possible. Yet an uncomfortable truth remained. The margin for error had shrunk. One evening, several farmers gathered to discuss conditions. The mood felt different from previous years. Not fearful, concerned. Experienced people recognized warning signs. A weak harvest did not guarantee disaster, but it increased vulnerability. If winter remained mild, most households would manage. If winter proved severe, difficulties might follow. Nature had created uncertainty. Now everyone waited to see what came next. Autumn arrived. Leaves changed color. Temperatures declined. Livestock returned closer to farm buildings. The familiar cycle continued. Yet beneath ordinary seasonal activities lurked an unusual tension. People prepared more aggressively than normal. Additional firewood was gathered. Food was carefully preserved. Repairs received extra attention. No one wanted to enter winter unprepared. The first snow arrived earlier than expected. That fact alone concerned many residents. Early snow often meant little. Sometimes it melted quickly. Sometimes it signaled a harsher season ahead. Nobody knew which possibility would unfold. Weeks passed. The snow remained. Cold temperatures strengthened. Storms appeared with increasing frequency. By midwinter, it had become clear that this season differed from recent years. The cold felt deeper. The snow felt heavier. The weather felt relentless. Even older residents began comparing conditions to winters from their youth. That comparison attracted attention because older residents rarely made such statements lightly. Leif noticed the change immediately. He had experienced winter before, many winters. But this felt different. The landscape appeared buried beneath extraordinary amounts of snow. Travel became difficult much earlier than usual. Animals consumed feed at alarming rates. Firewood disappeared rapidly. The season seemed determined to test everyone. One morning, after a night of intense snowfall, Leif stepped outside and stared across the valley. Several familiar landmarks had vanished completely. Fences disappeared beneath drifts. Paths could no longer be identified. Buildings looked smaller because snow surrounded them on all sides. The scene was beautiful, stunningly beautiful, and deeply unsettling. Nature often combined those qualities. The most dangerous conditions frequently appeared magnificent. Inside the longhouse, discussions became increasingly practical. How much hay remained? How much grain? How much firewood? The questions returned daily, not because people enjoyed repetition, because the answers changed constantly. Resources diminished. Winter continued. The calculations never stopped. News from neighboring settlements painted a troubling picture. Several farms had already lost livestock. Others struggled with damaged buildings. A few families reported dangerously low food reserves. The season still had months remaining. That reality worried everyone. The deadliest Viking winters often followed a recognizable pattern. A weak harvest reduced preparation levels. Then a severe winter arrived. The combination proved devastating. Either challenge alone might be manageable. Together, they created serious risk. As January deepened, temperatures plunged even further. Streams froze solid. Ice expanded across coastal waters. Travelers became rare. The world seemed locked in place. The cold penetrated everything. Clothing, walls, tools, bones. Simple tasks required enormous effort. Breathing cold air hurt. Working outdoors became exhausting. Many people spent as little time outside as possible. Yet responsibilities could not be ignored. Animals required care. Buildings required maintenance. Life continued regardless of weather. One evening, a traveler arrived carrying alarming news. Settlements farther north were already experiencing shortages. Not expected shortages, actual shortages. Food supplies had declined faster than anticipated. Livestock losses were increasing. Several communities feared what might happen if conditions persisted. The traveler described people comparing the winter to famous seasons remembered from decades earlier. That comparison spread unease. When older generations began referencing legendary winters, everyone paid attention. Those stories existed for a reason. The following weeks justified concern. Storm after storm swept across Scandinavia. Snow accumulated relentlessly. The landscape seemed trapped beneath an endless white blanket. Recovery periods between storms became shorter. Every time conditions improved, another storm appeared. People grew tired, not merely physically, Emotionally, mentally, the season felt oppressive, as though winter itself had settled permanently across the north. Leif often noticed silence inside the longhouse. Not uncomfortable silence, exhausted silence. People had discussed the same concerns for months. Eventually, conversation diminished. Everyone focused upon enduring. One afternoon, while checking livestock shelters, Leif discovered a sheep that had died during the night. The loss was unfortunate, not catastrophic, yet it represented another small blow, and severe winters often consisted of countless small blows, each one manageable individually, collectively exhausting. Across the valley, similar incidents occurred. A dead sheep here, a damaged roof there, spoiled food elsewhere. No single event caused disaster. The accumulation created danger. By February, food conservation had become stricter. Meals grew smaller, not dramatically, but noticeably. People adapted. They always did. Yet hunger began appearing more frequently in daily thoughts. Nothing sharpens awareness like scarcity. Children occasionally asked for larger portions. Adults exchanged concerned glances. Everyone understood the situation. The season was consuming resources faster than expected. Then came another problem: the hay reserves. Many households realized their livestock feed might not last until spring. The implications were serious. Without sufficient hay, animals weakened. Weak animals died. Dead animals represented immediate and future losses. Families faced difficult decisions. Some began slaughtering livestock earlier than planned. Others searched desperately for alternative feed sources. Neither option felt ideal. The winter had transformed ordinary planning into crisis management. One evening, an elderly farmer visited Eirik's household. The old man had survived more winters than anyone else in the valley. People respected his judgment. After listening to discussions about supplies and weather, he spoke quietly. He said the season reminded him of winters that people still talked about decades later. Not ordinary winters, the truly memorable ones, the ones that entered local history. The room fell silent because everyone understood the significance of his words. He was not speaking dramatically. He was speaking honestly, and honesty sometimes carried more weight than fear. Outside, snow continued falling. The wind whispered across the frozen valley. Darkness settled early as always. The landscape appeared endless, frozen, silent, unchanging. Yet beneath that silence, a growing realization spread through communities across Scandinavia. This was becoming one of those winters, one of the seasons people would remember, one of the seasons parents would describe to children years later, one of the seasons travelers would discuss around distant hearths. And for some settlements, the worst hardships had not even begun, because the most dangerous period of a severe Viking winter often arrived near the end. When food supplies reached their lowest levels, livestock weakened, hope faded, and spring remained frustratingly out of reach despite everyone's desperate desire to see it arrive. Because the most dangerous period of a severe Viking winter often arrived near the end, when food supplies reached their lowest levels, livestock weakened, hope faded, and spring remained frustratingly out of reach despite everyone's desperate desire to see it arrive. February settled over Scandinavia like a heavy blanket, not a comforting blanket, a crushing one. The season had already lasted for months, and now it entered the stage many families feared most. The stage when winter's earlier problems began combining together. Food shortages, exhaustion, animal losses, isolation, illness. Each challenge strengthened the others. A hungry person became more vulnerable to sickness. A sick person struggled to perform necessary work. Unfinished work created new problems. The cycle fed upon itself. In Irix Valley, conditions remained difficult but manageable. That distinction mattered. People were uncomfortable. People were worried. Yet most households still possessed a chance to reach spring without catastrophe. Farther north, however, reports described something much worse. Travelers arriving from coastal settlements spoke about communities operating on the edge of survival. Some families had already exhausted their best food supplies. Only emergency reserves remained. Others depended heavily upon whatever fish they could still obtain. Several settlements had begun sharing resources simply to prevent the weakest households from collapsing completely. Such cooperation was not unusual. Viking communities often relied upon networks of mutual support. Modern portrayals sometimes emphasize fierce independence. Reality was more complicated. People survived harsh environments by helping one another. A family refusing all cooperation rarely prospered for long. The environment itself encouraged community. One evening, Leif accompanied his father to visit a neighboring farm. The trip was short. During summer, it would have taken little time. Winter transformed even simple journeys into challenges. Snow remained deep. Cold winds swept across exposed areas. Progress required patience. When they arrived, the atmosphere inside the neighboring longhouse felt noticeably tense. The household remained functional. No immediate disaster existed. Yet concern hung in the air. The family had calculated their remaining food supplies repeatedly. Each calculation produced the same uncomfortable result. If spring arrived late, shortages would become unavoidable. Nobody wanted to say the word starvation. The possibility lingered regardless. Such conversations occurred throughout Scandinavia during severe winters, not because people enjoyed worrying, because uncertainty demanded attention. Ignoring reality never improved reality. The neighboring farmer described another concern. His livestock had become noticeably weaker. The animals still lived, yet their condition deteriorated. Stored feed was disappearing rapidly. Fresh grazing remained hidden beneath snow. The situation resembled a race. Could the animals survive long enough for spring grass to appear? The answer remained unknown. As Leif listened, he realized something important. Winter rarely presented clear victories or defeats. Instead, it created endless uncertainty. People lived between possibilities. Hope and fear existed simultaneously. Every day brought new calculations. Every storm altered expectations. Every small success felt temporary. The following week brought another major snowstorm. By now, many residents had lost track of how many storms had struck that winter. They seemed endless. One blended into the next. Snow fell throughout the day, then through the night, then through the following day. The wind intensified. Visibility vanished. The valley disappeared beneath swirling white chaos. Inside the longhouses, people waited. There was little else they could do. Nature controlled events. Human beings endured them. During the height of the storm, strange sounds echoed through the darkness. The wind howled around buildings. Snow slid from roofs. Timbers creaked under pressure. Children listened nervously. Even adults found the sounds unsettling. Storms possessed a way of making people feel small. Because they were small, against the forces of nature, every community remained vulnerable. When calm finally returned, damage appeared throughout the valley. Several structures required repair. Animal shelters needed reinforcement. Paths vanished once again. The storm had not created catastrophe. It had simply added another burden, and severe winters excelled at accumulating burdens. One afternoon, while inspecting livestock, Leif noticed that several animals appeared thinner than ever before. The sight troubled him. Winter had transformed them. Months earlier, they had seemed strong and healthy. Now ribs showed beneath their coats. Movements lacked energy. The animals had survived, but survival carried a cost. The same could be said of people. Faces appeared leaner. Clothing fit differently. Everyone felt the strain. Nobody escaped untouched. As February progressed, stories from other regions became increasingly alarming. One traveler described settlements where people had begun consuming food normally reserved for emergencies. Another spoke about families forced to slaughter valuable breeding animals. A third described abandoned farms standing silent beneath the snow. The stories varied. The theme remained constant. Winter was winning. Not everywhere, but in enough places to cause concern. Leif often thought about those distant communities. What did their days look like? How did they endure? How much worse were their conditions compared to his own valley? The questions lingered because the Viking world, though vast, remained connected through trade routes, family ties, and shared experiences. A hardship in one region often became known elsewhere. Knowledge traveled, warnings traveled, stories traveled. One particularly grim report described a settlement where hunger had altered behavior itself. People became quieter, less social, more withdrawn. Conversations focused almost entirely upon food and survival. The traveler explained that prolonged scarcity changed the atmosphere of the entire community. Hope diminished, humor disappeared. The future seemed difficult to imagine. Such descriptions resonated with older residents. Several nodded knowingly. They had witnessed similar conditions during previous hardships. Extreme winters affected more than bodies. They affected minds. Morale could become another casualty of the season. One evening, the elderly farmer who had earlier compared the winter to legendary seasons returned once more. The old man sat near the fire and listened while younger people discussed weather, supplies, and rumors from distant settlements. Eventually he spoke. His voice remained calm, steady, experienced. He explained that the most dangerous moment often arrived when people believed they could see the end, not because conditions improved, because exhaustion accumulated. By late winter, everyone was tired, physically tired, emotionally tired, mentally tired. Mistakes became more likely. Patience became scarce. Hope became fragile. The observation carried weight. Everyone present understood its truth. Months of hardship leave marks. Even strong people eventually feel worn down. The old man then described a winter from his youth, a winter remembered throughout the region for decades afterward. He recalled families celebrating too early when a brief thaw arrived. Then another wave of severe cold struck. The setback devastated already weakened communities. Several households never recovered. His story served as a warning. Spring had not arrived yet. The season remained dangerous. Outside, however, subtle changes continued. Daylight increased, almost imperceptibly at first. Then, more noticeably, the sun lingered longer. The sky appeared brighter. Birds occasionally appeared. Tiny signs, yet important ones. They reminded people that winter, however powerful, remained temporary. The challenge lay in surviving long enough to witness its retreat. For some communities, that challenge was becoming increasingly difficult. As March approached, food supplies reached critically low levels in several northern regions. Travelers reported households counting individual days of provisions, not weeks, days. The distinction was terrifying. When supplies are measured in days, every delay matters. Every storm matters. Every setback matters. Communities in such situations lived beneath constant pressure. One unexpected event could push them beyond their limits. Leif listened to these reports with growing unease. The stories felt increasingly serious. increasingly urgent, and yet spring remained frustratingly distant. The snow still covered much of the landscape. The cold still dominated nights. The fields still lay frozen. Nature offered hints of change without delivering actual relief. Perhaps that was the cruelest aspect of severe Viking winters. Near the end, people could often see signs of spring. They simply could not reach it yet. Hope appeared on the horizon. Food did not. Warmth appeared in brief moments. Winter always returned. The future seemed close enough to imagine, but too distant to touch. And across Scandinavia, countless families now found themselves trapped in that painful space between endurance and relief, waiting to discover whether their preparations, sacrifices, and determination would be enough to carry them through the final weeks of one of the harshest winters anyone could remember. And across Scandinavia, countless families now found themselves trapped in that painful space between endurance and relief, waiting to discover whether their preparations, sacrifices, and determination would be enough to carry them through the final weeks of one of the harshest winters anyone could remember. March arrived, yet for many Viking communities, its arrival brought little immediate comfort. Modern calendars often create the impression that seasons change neatly. Winter ends, spring begins. Reality was far less orderly, especially in Scandinavia. The calendar might declare spring was approaching, but the snow covering the landscape paid no attention. The frozen ground paid no attention. The cold winds sweeping down from the mountains paid no attention. Nature followed its own schedule, and during particularly severe years, that schedule could be cruel. Leif noticed the frustration everywhere. People expected progress. Instead, they received delays. The days grew longer. That much was undeniable. Sunlight lingered later into the evening. Morning arrived earlier. The sky appeared brighter. Yet despite those encouraging signs, winter refused to release its grip. Snow remained deep across fields. Ice still covered large sections of water. Travel remained difficult. The contrast between expectation and reality wore upon people. They could see improvement. They simply could not benefit from it yet. Food supplies continued shrinking. By now, many households had reached levels they normally would not experience until much later in the season. The poor harvest from the previous year haunted every calculation. Every meal reminded people of it. Every glance into a storage barrel reminded people of it. The harvest had not failed completely, but it had been weak enough to make this winter exceptionally dangerous. Throughout history, severe winters often became deadly because of events that occurred months earlier. People tended to blame the snow, the cold, the storms, yet the true causes frequently began during summer and autumn. A poor harvest created vulnerability. Winter merely exposed it. One afternoon, A traveler arrived carrying disturbing news from settlements farther inland. Several communities had begun slaughtering breeding animals. Normally, such animals were protected whenever possible. They represented future prosperity, future growth, future security. Destroying them solved immediate problems, but created long-term difficulties. Families only made such decisions when circumstances left few alternatives. The traveler explained that many people viewed the choice as deeply painful, yet hunger leaves little room for sentiment. The future matters greatly. The present matters first. Inside the longhouse, silence followed the report. Everyone understood the implications. Communities forced to consume their future wealth often required years to recover. Even if spring arrived tomorrow, the consequences would linger. The following days brought unusual weather. For a brief period, temperatures rose noticeably. Snow softened. Water flowed more freely. People emerged from their homes with renewed optimism. Children laughed. Farmers inspected fields. The atmosphere improved almost immediately. Such was the power of hope. Then winter struck again. Another wave of cold descended across the region. The thaw ended. Fresh snow arrived. Streams froze once more. The emotional impact proved surprisingly severe, not because the weather itself was unprecedented, because expectations had risen. People had begun imagining relief. Its sudden disappearance felt crushing. The elderly farmer, who often shared stories from earlier decades, merely nodded when he heard people complaining. He had seen this before, many times. Late winter often excelled at disappointment. Nature seemed to enjoy reminding people that spring could not be rushed. One evening, while repairing equipment near the hearth, Leif listened as several older residents discussed famous winters from the past. The conversation gradually shifted towards something deeper. Memory. They spoke about how certain winters became permanent landmarks in people's lives. Not years, winters. A person might describe an event by saying it occurred before a terrible winter, or after a terrible winter. The season itself became a point of reference. That fact fascinated Leif. It revealed how profoundly winter shaped society. Wars came and went. Leaders rose and fell. Yet ordinary people often measured time through seasons of survival. The discussion continued late into the evening. One man recalled a winter that forced dozens of families to migrate. Another remembered widespread livestock losses. A third spoke about years of hardship following a particularly severe season. Each story reinforced the same lesson. Winter's consequences extended far beyond winter itself. The next morning brought fresh evidence of strain. A neighboring household requested assistance. Their food reserves had fallen lower than expected. Not critically low, not yet, but low enough to create concern. Several families agreed to help. The decision was practical as much as compassionate. Communities survived together. A weakened neighbor could eventually become everyone's problem. Mutual aid increased collective resilience. Throughout Viking Scandinavia, cooperation frequently served as an important survival strategy. Modern depictions sometimes overlook this reality. The image of rugged individuals facing nature alone makes for dramatic storytelling. Reality usually involved networks of support, shared labor, shared resources, shared responsibility. People who helped one another often endured hardships more effectively. As March progressed, the valley slowly changed. Not dramatically, gradually, tiny patches of exposed earth appeared in sheltered areas. Streams grew louder. Bird activity increased. The signs remained subtle, yet nobody missed them. After months of winter, people paid close attention to every indication of change. Hope had become precious. Even the smallest evidence mattered. Still, danger remained. Food supplies sat near their lowest levels. Animals remained weak. Many households possessed little margin for error. A single major storm could create serious problems. A late freeze could delay recovery. The season's power diminished, but it had not vanished. One afternoon, another traveler arrived from the north. His stories were among the most troubling yet. He described entire communities struggling with what modern historians would recognize as famine conditions. People survived, but barely. Meals had become extremely limited. Energy levels collapsed. Productivity declined. Illness spread more easily among weakened populations. The traveler emphasized that the situation developed slowly. No dramatic moment announced the crisis. It simply worsened day after day. That gradual deterioration made it particularly dangerous. People adapted to worsening conditions until one day they realized how severe those conditions had become. The account left a strong impression upon everyone who heard it because it highlighted an uncomfortable truth. Human beings can become accustomed to remarkable hardship, sometimes too accustomed. People focus on surviving today, then tomorrow, then the next day. Meanwhile, larger problems continue growing. One evening, Leif stepped outside shortly before sunset. The air remained cold, yet something felt different. The light, the quality of it. Winter sunlight often appeared weak and distant. This felt stronger, warmer, more confident. The mountains reflected golden colors. The snow glowed softly. For several moments, the landscape looked almost peaceful, not threatening, not hostile, peaceful. The sight reminded him that winter and beauty were not opposites. The same season capable of causing suffering could also produce breathtaking scenes. That contradiction defined much of life in the North. People loved the landscapes that challenged them, feared the forces that sustained them, admired the environment that occasionally threatened their survival. All those emotions existed together, back inside the longhouse. Preparations for spring continued despite uncertainty. Tools required maintenance. Plans required discussion. Fields required consideration. These activities served practical purposes. They also served psychological ones. Preparing for the future helped people believe in the future. Every repaired tool represented confidence that planting season would arrive. Every conversation about crops represented faith that life would continue. Such faith mattered, especially after a difficult winter. As the month neared its end, reports from distant settlements suggested conditions were finally beginning to improve. Not everywhere, not immediately, but enough places to create cautious optimism. Fishing opportunities increased. Travel became easier. Some livestock reached fresh grazing earlier than expected. The changes were small, yet collectively significant. For the first time in many months, the balance appeared to be shifting. Winter was still dangerous, but spring was beginning to win. The struggle was not over. Far from it, many communities remained vulnerable. Many families remained hungry. Many animals remained weak. Yet the direction of events had changed. And for people who had endured one of the harshest winters in memory, that change felt enormous. Because after months spent wondering whether they could outlast the season, they were finally beginning to ask a different question. Not whether they would survive, but how much the winter had cost them, and whether the scars it left behind would shape their lives for years to come. Not whether they would survive, but how much the winter had cost them, and whether the scars it left behind would shape their lives for years to come. As April advanced, the question became impossible to ignore. The worst of winter was finally retreating. Snow still lingered across mountain slopes. Cold nights still reminded everyone that the season had not completely vanished. Yet the immediate struggle for survival was ending. Now came the reckoning. Communities throughout Scandinavia began counting losses. Not merely food losses, not merely livestock losses. All losses, animals, buildings, resources, opportunities, people. The accounting revealed something important. A severe Viking winter did not end when the snow melted. Its effects often continued for months or years afterward. Leif noticed this reality almost immediately. Several neighboring farms entered spring in very different conditions. One household retained most of its animals and enough resources to begin rebuilding quickly. Another had survived, but possessed little beyond the essentials. A third family faced a daunting recovery after losing livestock that would take years to replace. The contrast was striking. Everyone had endured the same winter, yet everyone emerged differently. Such inequalities often shaped the future of communities. A farm weakened by winter might struggle to produce a strong harvest. A weak harvest could create vulnerability during the next winter. The cycle could continue. Success and hardship frequently reinforced themselves. This was one reason some settlements gradually prospered, while others slowly declined. One difficult season rarely determined everything. Several difficult seasons in succession sometimes did. The valley itself appeared transformed. Where endless white drifts had once dominated the landscape, patches of green now spread steadily across fields. Streams overflowed with meltwater. Birds nested. The air carried scents absent for months. Wet earth, fresh grass, growing plants, to people emerging from a long winter. These smells felt almost miraculous. Life had returned. The return lifted spirits throughout the community. Yet conversations remained serious. Farmers understood that recovery depended upon what happened next. The coming harvest mattered enormously, perhaps more than usual. Many families had consumed resources they normally preferred to preserve. Some had depleted emergency reserves. Others had reduced livestock numbers. A strong growing season could repair much of the damage. A poor one could extend hardship. Nature once again held tremendous influence over their future. One afternoon, a gathering took place near the edge of the valley. Farmers, fishermen, and families shared information about conditions throughout the region. The meeting possessed an atmosphere unlike those held during winter. There was relief, but also reflection. People wanted to understand what had happened, what lessons could be learned, what mistakes should not be repeated. The discussions revealed common themes. Many households wished they had gathered more hay. Others wished they had preserved additional food. Several people mentioned repairs they should have completed before autumn. The observations were practical rather than emotional. Winter had delivered a harsh education. People intended to remember it. An elderly woman spoke about something else. She argued that preparation alone could not explain survival. Luck mattered. Weather mattered. Timing mattered. The room largely agreed. Hard work increased survival chances. Yet even the most diligent family could encounter circumstances beyond their control. A storm arriving at the wrong moment, a livestock illness, a failed crop. Human effort mattered greatly. Nature still retained the final vote. The conversation continued for hours. By the end, one conclusion seemed unavoidable. The deadliest Viking winters were dangerous precisely because they attacked multiple aspects of life simultaneously. Food supplies declined. Animals weakened. Travel became difficult. Trade slowed. Illness spread more easily. Morale deteriorated. The season created pressure from every direction. Communities rarely failed because of a single problem. They failed because numerous problems accumulated. One morning, Leif accompanied several men to inspect farms located farther from the main valley. Some had experienced greater hardship than others. The journey offered a broader perspective. Several farms appeared busy with recovery efforts. Fences were being rebuilt, fields prepared, livestock moved toward grazing areas. Life continued. Other locations told darker stories. One farm stood empty. Its owners had departed during winter. No one knew whether they had joined relatives elsewhere or continued traveling. The buildings remained silent, weathered, abandoned. The site left a strong impression. Winter's consequences could become physical landmarks, visible reminders of hardship. Throughout Scandinavia, similar abandoned farms occasionally dotted the landscape. Each possessed its own story. Each represented a family forced to make difficult choices. Modern archaeologists sometimes uncover such places centuries later. Broken tools, collapsed structures, fragments of daily life, evidence that people once lived there, evidence that something changed. Harsh winters often formed part of that story. As the weeks passed, trade gradually resumed. Merchants appeared more frequently. Ships returned to coastal waters. Roads became usable again. The reopening of connections between communities provided enormous benefits. Winter isolation had ended. Information flowed more freely. Goods moved more easily. Opportunities expanded. The improvement highlighted another hidden danger of Viking winters: isolation itself. Many modern people underestimate how difficult prolonged isolation can be. Winter often cut communities off from one another for months. Assistance became harder to obtain. News traveled slowly. Problems remained local. The return of communication felt liberating. One merchant arriving from distant settlements carried particularly interesting reports. He described regions where entire local economies had been disrupted by winter losses. Some communities lacked enough animals to maintain previous levels of production. Others struggled because population losses reduced available labor. Recovery varied enormously. Certain settlements rebounded quickly. Others required years. The stories reinforced an important reality. Winter was not merely a seasonal challenge. It could become an economic challenge, a demographic challenge, a social challenge. Its influence extended into nearly every aspect of life. Leif found himself thinking increasingly about the future, not merely the coming summer, the coming winters. The severe season they had just survived would eventually become another story told around the hearth. Children would hear about it. Grandchildren might hear about it. The memory would persist, and that memory would shape behavior. People who experience hardship often prepare differently afterward. They become more cautious, more attentive, more deliberate. Entire communities can change in response to difficult events. One evening, while sitting beside the fjord, Leif watched fishing boats returning home. The sight would have been impossible during much of winter. Ice Storms, darkness, all had prevented such activity. Now the boats moved freely across open water. The scene symbolized recovery, life expanding once again. Yet he also knew that recovery remained incomplete. The valley had survived, but survival did not erase consequences. Families still mourned losses. Resources remained limited. Work remained abundant. The future required effort, a great deal of effort. As summer approached, optimism steadily increased. Fields turned greener. Animals grew stronger. Food sources diversified. The worst fears of late winter faded. People laughed more frequently. Celebrations became more common. The psychological weight, carried for months, slowly lifted. The transformation demonstrated something remarkable about human beings. Given opportunity, people recover. Not instantly, not perfectly, but often with impressive resilience. The Vikings possessed that resilience in abundance. They needed it. Life in northern environments demanded it. Still, resilience should never be mistaken for invulnerability. Even the strongest communities had limits. The severe winter had revealed those limits clearly. Some families reached them. Some settlements reached them. Some never fully recovered. That was the hidden truth behind the legends of the North. The greatest threat was often not a rival warrior or a distant enemy. The greatest threat was the environment itself. Cold, darkness, scarcity, isolation. Those forces claimed far more lives than most battles ever did. And as Leif listened to stories arriving from regions even farther north, stories of extraordinary winters remembered across generations, he began to realize that the season his valley had just survived, terrible though it seemed, might not even rank among the worst winters Viking Scandinavia had ever known, because history preserved accounts of years when nature became even more unforgiving, bringing conditions so severe that entire regions seemed to struggle against the possibility of collapse itself, because history preserved accounts of years when nature became even more unforgiving, bringing conditions so severe that entire regions seemed to struggle against the possibility of collapse itself. As the years passed, the terrible winter that had tested Eirik, Leif, and their valley gradually became part of local memory. Children who had once huddled beside the hearth grew into adults. Adults became elders. Stories traveled from one generation to the next. The winter was remembered, discussed, learned from, yet it eventually took its place among many other winters that had shaped the lives of Scandinavian people. That is often how history works. The events that feel overwhelming in the moment slowly become lessons for those who come afterward. And those lessons mattered because the Vikings never truly escaped winter. No matter how successful a harvest became, no matter how prosperous a farm appeared, no matter how many voyages crossed the seas, Another winter always waited beyond the horizon. The cycle never stopped. Summer brought growth. Autumn demanded preparation. Winter tested everything. Spring rewarded those who endured. Then the process began again. For modern people, it can be difficult to fully appreciate just how much power the seasons held over Viking life. Today, a cold winter may be inconvenient. For the Vikings, a cold winter could determine whether a family survived. A poor harvest was not merely disappointing. It could become deadly months later. A damaged roof was not merely an expensive repair. It could expose people to freezing conditions. A lost animal was not merely lost property. It might represent food, labor, milk, wool, and future security, disappearing all at once. Every resource mattered. Every decision mattered. Every season mattered. That is why Viking winters were so deadly. Not because of a single dramatic threat, not because of one great catastrophe, but because countless smaller dangers combined together. Cold weakened people. Darkness affected morale. Isolation limited assistance. Food supplies diminished. Animals grew weaker. Illness spread more easily. Travel became hazardous. One challenge reinforced another. And when enough of those challenges arrived at the same time, even strong communities struggled. The Vikings are often remembered as fearless warriors, as explorers who crossed oceans, as adventurers who reached distant lands. Those achievements were remarkable. Yet, for most people living in Scandinavia, the greatest victory happened much closer to home. It happened every spring, when families emerged from their longhouses, when livestock survived another season, when fields could once again be planted, when children who had endured months of darkness saw the world turning green. Those quiet victories rarely appeared in sagas, yet they were among the most important victories of all, because without them, nothing else would have been possible. No voyages, no trade, no exploration, no kingdoms. The survival of ordinary people formed the foundation upon which Viking society rested. As Leif grew older, he often found himself repeating the same stories he had once heard from elders. Stories about preparation, stories about difficult winters, stories about communities helping one another survive. At first, he barely noticed he was doing it. Then one day, he realized something important. The stories were not merely entertainment. They were tools, warnings carried through generations, knowledge preserved through memory. Every tale of hardship taught someone how to avoid repeating old mistakes. Every account of survival increased the chances that another family might endure future challenges. In that way, the lessons of winter outlived winter itself. Years later, when Leif stood watching another autumn sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and red, he felt a familiar awareness settling over the valley. People were gathering hay, repairing buildings, preserving food. stacking firewood, preparing, just as they always had, just as they always would. The coming winter remained unknown. Perhaps it would be mild. Perhaps it would be harsh. No one could say. But the people of the valley understood something their ancestors had learned long ago. Hope was important. Preparation was essential. And survival often depended upon respecting nature rather than trying to conquer it. The mountains stood silent beyond the fjord. The forests darkened beneath the fading light. The sea reflected the colors of evening. Everything looked peaceful, yet hidden within that beauty was the same power that had shaped generations of lives. The same power that had created fear, resilience, tragedy, and triumph. Winter would return. It always returned. And when it did, another generation would face the same ancient challenge: to endure the darkness, to preserve enough food, to protect their families, to reach spring, because in the Viking world, survival was never guaranteed. It was earned, year after year, season after season, through patience, through preparation, through community, and through the quiet determination of ordinary people whose greatest battle was often not fought with swords, but against the relentless cold of the northern winter. The snow would melt, the grass would grow, the seasons would turn, and life would continue, just as it had for centuries, just as it always would. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.